Hi everyone. We're just gonna wait a minute or two while people join. So just bear with us. Hi everyone. Sorry. I was just gonna say, please bear with us. We're just waiting for some slides to upload.
Thanks. Got it.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Palestine Liberation Organizing event, Consolidating Gains in the Face of the New McCarthyism, presented by CUNY for Palestine and the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at SFSU. Next, all right. So first, I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. So San Francisco State University was built on unceded land. The Ramadiosh Alwan peoples who continue to live on this land and experience continued acts of displacement. The students and faculty at the university benefit from the occupation of the land, and we have a responsibility to bring this experience into our discussion on imperialism and occupation. Another land acknowledgement for those of us that are here in New York City. The city and the university that we fight for were built on the unceded land of the Lenapes people. The theft of this land, which is both historical and continuing, along with the stolen blood and work of enslaved Africans, enables our presence, academic institution, and the nation state itself that were founded on and continue to enact an exclusion and erasure of indigenous peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle ongoing practices and legacies of settler colonialism. We pay our respects to indigenous, African, and immigrant elders past, present, and future who have stewarded this land, and particularly to the hundreds of indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle ongoing practices and legacies of settler colonialism and racial capitalism, and to ensure that CUNY does not contribute to further colonial displacement of racialized and oppressed communities through real estate speculation, gentrification, and the targeted policing and surveillance of Black, brown, and other communities of color that accompany these processes. Additionally, there are a number of events, but first I would like to also acknowledge the Arab and Black solidarity. Juneteenth was this past Sunday. An important and critical event that finally was made into, I guess, a federal holiday that should have been very, very long ago acknowledged, of the breakage of slavery and honestly, the anti-Blackness that we continue to experience in the United States every single day, and globally, to be frank. Additionally, World Refugee Day was this past week as well. We acknowledge refugees across the globe, as well as those that are faced to leave Palestine and their homelands due to Zionist violence and forces that continue to displace and murder those that are on their own land. And then finally, it is Pride Month as well. Reaching farther back beyond, honestly, the Stonewall riots, there was also the Compton cafeteria riots in San Francisco that I want to acknowledge, that is often erased from history, that happened 3 years prior to the Stonewall riots. Both of these riots were resistance to state violence, specifically policing violence that we still face today among queer and trans communities across the globe, including queer and trans folks that exist and live on the land of Palestine as well. Palestinians themselves. I'd also like to announce the contingent of queers and BDS and Queers for Palestine as well. So thank you so much. Also, my name is Jamila Hamami. I am a number of things. I'm a longtime organizer. I am also a Hunter alum, and then I also have taught a number of courses at Hunter College, including community organizing. And then I am also at John Jay College in the Africana Studies Department and teach community justice. Additionally, I am a lecturer at AMED as well, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program. And I'm thrilled to be there and the connection. Oh, and also a member of the CUNY PSC Union, PSC CUNY Union, excuse me, and an organizer at the CUNY Adjunct Project. Thank you all for attending. And I'm going to kick it on over to our folks. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that really beautiful introduction, Jamila, and land acknowledgement, as well as thank you so much for all the amazing tech support you're providing, along with the amazing, equally amazing Laith Hulum from Ahmed, who will be co-moderating this event with me, and we'll have introductions for in a moment. I also want to thank CUNY for Palestine and Ahmed, the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas, Race and Resistance Studies program, and the CUNY Adjunct Project for co-sponsoring and supporting this event. My name is Karina Mullen, and I teach at CUNY as an adjunct on John Jay and Brooklyn College campuses. I'm also a member of CUNY for Palestine, CUNY Against Racism, and Cross CUNY Committee Against Racism and Colonialism, which was set up in the aftermath of or in response to the backlash against the PSC CUNY Union's June 2021 resolution in solidarity with Palestinian people, and which I'm sure there'll be much discussion of in the panel today. And also, I'm a member of the steering committee of the PSC's International Committee. And I'll now begin with our introduction to the event. And I just want to thank everyone who's joining us here today for making the time to be with us today. And also special thanks, of course, to all of our wonderful and amazing panelists who Laith will introduce in a moment as well. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So despite the constant barrage of Zionist attacks faced by students and academic, as well as non-academic workers organizing in solidarity with Palestine liberation, with often little to no protection, or worse, the complicity of college administrations and politicians, the Palestine solidarity movement across our campuses has been growing and consolidating its gains over a number of years. In fact, we understand these two developments as connected. The more Palestine solidarity grows successfully, the more backlash against it grows as well. It is for this reason that Professor Rabab Abdulhadi first used the term New McCarthyism in a 2014 interview with Against the Current to describe the repressive context for Palestine liberation organizing. To understand the new, we first, though, have to recall the old McCarthyism. Similar to today, the first generation of McCarthyism was also a counter-revolutionary moment, or a movement, response rather, to the successes of popular liberation movements. And that includes, of course, the successful communist revolutions in Russia in 1917 and China in 1949. But also, and we tend to think about McCarthyism in relation to a backlash to communism in the context of the Cold War, and those adherents or supporters of communism here in the US, in the belly of the beast. But there's also, we can also think about it in terms of the larger context of that moment and the counter-revolution against global South, anti-colonial struggles, decolonization, and of course, here in the belly of the beast, various successful radical labor struggles, many of which were connected to the Communist Party at the time, Black and Puerto Rican liberation struggles, which also were working in coalition, often in different ways with these other struggles, and the growing connections between all of these with Global South liberation movements. So the forms of oppression associated with McCarthyism of this era have been repurposed for the current moment. We have some of the same old players. Of course, there's still the settler, and unfortunately, the settler colonial white supremacist imperialist state in which we reside, or some of us do, and capital, which works in alliance and is protected by that state, and some new players as well, new, especially in the context of that we'll be discussing today, new Zionist organizations, politicians aligned, as well as politicians aligned with the Israeli settler colonial apartheid regime. And there are multiple levels and scales, as with the original McCarthyism. There are multiple levels and scales of the current McCarthyite attacks. That includes policing and surveillance. So we see in relation to Palestine or solidarity organizing, students and faculty speaking out about Palestine, particularly Palestinian, Arab, Muslim, and other students of color who have been surveilled and policed by the various institutions of organized violence, including the FBI and local police forces, often with the silence and or complicity of our university administrations. On what we can think of as the juridical level, there's what's often referred to as lawfare. Most recently, there was yesterday's Eighth Circuit Court decision on Arkansas's anti-BDS law, which really is an attack on our right to dissent. Arkansas is one of 33 states that have passed legislation punishing boycotts of Israel by U.S. state legislatures since 2015. These anti-BDS bills are developed and pushed by the conservative American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and supported even directly by the Israeli state, which has funneled through an NGO cover millions of dollars to U.S. groups, which in turn lobby in favor of these bills. There also are the more targeted attacks that have impacted people and institutions within our communities, many of whom are on this call with us today, including, for example, the lawsuit filed in federal court in 2017 by the Lawfare Project against Professor Rabab Abdulhadi and San Francisco State University that had sought to compel the university to restrict the speech of students and faculty who support Palestine liberation. And the current lawsuit against CUNY's union, the PSC, by 6 CUNY professors claiming that the organization is anti-Semitic. The third category is the attacks, harassment, and defamation, both online and off, by well-funded Zionist organizations. So there are national organizations like the Canary Mission, Campus Watch, Middle East Forum, or AMCHA, or individuals like including individuals like David Horowitz, and online Zionist platforms that seek to blacklist Palestine solidarity organizers, as well as the Anti-Defamation League, an organization with close ties with the police and the FBI that seeks to muzzle and or punish those who oppose the apartheid Israeli settler colonial regime, targeting scholars such as Rabab Abdulhadi, the Ahmed Program, Stephen Saleta, Hatem Bazian, and others. Closer to home in New York, we have the proliferation of Zionist organizations, including Resign PSC, which urges union members to resign. And that was part of the Zionist backlash, which is both internal and external, to some of the successes that will be discussed today, including the PSC's resolution, which I mentioned earlier in June 2021, in response to the acceleration of settler colonial and apartheid Israeli violence. Safe CUNY, as well as CUNY for Inclusion and Safe CUNY, which have nice sounding names, but of course are designed to do the exact opposite of what they claim to do, and they've contributed to the fears and vulnerability of especially Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim CUNY students and workers. We witnessed these racist attacks most recently against Nurdin Kiswani, who is with us here today, after her commencement speech at CUNY Law. So because of the constraints that these forms of repression, the new McCarthyism, impose on our organizing, we often spend most of our time in these kinds of events speaking about these instruments of oppression. But one of the aims of this event, and as we have all discussed together, we wanted to really bring attention to, and this is where we'll be shifting now as I pass the floor to Laith, is to speak about the victories that we want to build on and consolidate, and really that these mechanisms of power seek to control and dismantle. So without further ado, pass it to Laith.
Thank you, Karina. Like the victories that helped launch the Communist Party into mainstream society in the United States with almost 1 million members in the 1930s, the cultural consciousness surrounding Palestine has shifted dramatically in recent years. Following the decades of work that activists have done to fight for their voice and rights, and some recent reports from organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, who arrived at the same conclusions Palestinians and their supporters have been saying for decades. The socio-political, cultural, and intellectual climate has shifted dramatically, as evidenced by recent polls taken after Israel's actions to expand internationally illegal settler colonial outposts in Jerusalem last year, as well as the discourse of social justice in the United States. On campuses, students, faculty, and staff have been leading the way in many instances, with many organizations resisting bans and winning official recognition from their universities. And student governments have considered and passed BDS resolutions through the efforts of students, faculty, and staff who have refused to ignore injustices on their campus and in their communities. Some of these victories at San Francisco State include, in 2020, the student government passed a BDS resolution. The California Faculty Association approved the PAM caucus recognizing Islamophobia, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian racism as major union-busting forces. The San Francisco Labor Council unanimously adopted the resolution submitted by the CFA chapter. This year, 3 grievance hearings that determined that San Francisco State had impeded academic freedom on Palestine, that they have violated contractual agreements to prevent the growth of Arab and Muslim ethnicities in diaspora studies, or Ahmed studies. There was recently an announcement that the president is conceding a faculty line in Ahmed studies after the efforts of supporting community members. At CUNY, in May of 2021, student-led protests in several CUNY campus groups, as well as CUNY for Palestine statements and political education, signed and attended by thousands against accelerated Israeli settler colonial and apartheid violence and CUNY's institutional complicity. In June of that year, the PSC union representing CUNY professors passed a resolution to condemn the actions of Israel last year. In December, CUNY Law student government passed a BDS resolution, which was followed by the May 2022 Faculty Council resolution endorsing the BDS resolution. And the PSC CUNY Solidarity resolution with SFSU professors Abdul Hadi and Kinukawa against censorship and silencing of Palestine over the September 23rd, 2020 Open Classroom, whose narratives, gender, justice, and resistance, a conversation with Layla Khaled. However, this can also be a very vulnerable time in the careers of student, faculty, and staff who can face smear campaigns and the permanent online presence of organizations like Canary Mission, Hillel, Lawfare, and the Academic Engagement Network, which can be devastating. There is a need for student worker alliances in order to protect each other and reduce vulnerability, which I believe we will discuss here with our esteemed panelists. Joining us today are Lawrence Johnson, a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, whose primary interests are racial theory and Black politics. He is an organizing member of the Brooklyn College Anti-Racism Coalition, chair of Black faculty and staff, and co-chair of the PSC Anti-Racism Committee. Rabab Abdulhadi, who is the director and senior scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program, associate professor of ethnic studies and affiliated faculty in sexuality studies at San Francisco State University. She co-chairs the Palestine, Arab, and Muslim Caucus of the Racial and Social Justice Council of the California Faculty Association and serves on the advisory boards of the U.S. Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, National Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Executive Committee of California Scholars for Academic Freedom. James Martell, who is a professor in the Department of Political Science and chapter president of the California Faculty Association. He teaches courses in political theory, continental philosophy, anarchism, post-colonial theory, and theories of gender and sexuality. He is the author of 7 books with an 8th book that is forthcoming, Anarchist Prophets, Disappointing Vision, and the Power of Collective Sight. Nurdine Kiswani is a Palestinian organizer from New York City. She is the founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, United for Palestine, a community organization revitalizing the revolutionary spirit of Palestinians in exile in pursuit of liberation. Through Within Our Lifetime, Nurdine has spoken for the Palestinian cause at events nationwide and worldwide, building solidarity with oppressed nationalities fighting for liberation. And without further ado, I'll pass it along to my co-host, Karina, who will start us off with questions for our panelists.
Great. Thank you for that, Leigh. Wonderful. So our first round of questions is going to be on the nature of the neoliberal university and how it shapes our organizing. So the public university in a racial capitalist, settler colonial imperialist state, which this is full of contradictions and tensions. So we want to ask our wonderful speakers, how do organizers navigate these contradictions and tensions, and how do they shape our approach to using the resources and institutional mechanisms of the university? What are the connections between Palestine liberation organizing and the various labor and student issues we face within the neoliberal university, including this is a longish list just meant to get us started. Obviously, I know speakers only have 5 minutes each, so they won't be able to address all of these points, but I'm sure we'll come back to them in the Q&A that follows afterwards. But first, including racist and sexist austerity, debt, financialization, and other forms of value extraction that the neoliberal university is engaged in. The university as property manager, real estate speculation, its connections to colonial gentrification and dispossession of local communities, institutionalized racism, the university's entanglements with the institutions of empire, as well as the police state, increased adjunctification of higher education and the exploitative multi-tier system in place, declining salaries and benefits, as well as super exploitation of graduate students and adjuncts who earn poverty wages, bloated and highly paid management, worker layoffs, which of course increased during the health pandemic, during the current health crisis, and rising tuition fees. So we'll start with the order for this round of questions will be Lawrence, followed by Rabab, followed by Nardine, and then James. So Lawrence, would you like to begin?
Sure. I think the question of the neoliberal university really, begs the question, what is the DNA of the university in general? And I think that brings us to an analysis of neoliberalism today. But I think a basic Marxist analysis, although very general, gets us very close to thinking about the spaces we occupy as faculty, staff, and students. So, when we think about, labor movements historically, especially radical movements, it's always been, a question of, how do we think about production? What is the role of the university in terms of managing social relations and things like that? So when I think about neoliberalism in this very specific project, going more specific than Marx's idea of how universities are bourgeois institution to manage the affairs of the capitalist, I think it's a question of what type of production does the university have today? And of course, there's a list of things that you mentioned, but I think more specifically about what type of, citizens, what type of people, human beings are turned out. And that's what I think about my own personal experience to go from, theoretical and abstract to very practical. I was 11 years old in 1990, and I went to a protest here in Chicago to protest the police captain, John Burge, who was guilty of torturing over 100, Black people here in the city of Chicago. And this was a very controversial issue. And at 11 years old, I didn't have much of a political analysis, but in the rallies and protests that I went to, I was surrounded by people who not only made connections to racism in the Chicago Police Department, but also they made connections to, what was happening in South Africa around time of Nelson Mandela's, release from prison. But it was also these connections to, what was happening in Palestine. And these were, I want to say to some degree in the organizing spaces here in Chicago amongst certain political actors, these were common sense analyses. And since then, you get older, you leave home, you leave your community, and you go to college, you go to graduate school, and you're a professor, and those common sense analyses that you were part of your socialization growing up that help you make sense of everyday reality, you have to struggle to keep those in your professional life in a place where you're supposed to be educating, right? So it really begs the question that beyond budgets and all these different things that's very much associated with a neoliberal university, it really shapes the type of professor, the type of student you could be. And ultimately, when we talk about the victories that we've had, really thinking about the CUNY system, in which others will talk about more, we've made some recent pushes in the academic space that we've never had to push in other spaces. They were common sense. So I think that's the part that, still fascinates me to some extent, where in the university, we have to make pushes and consolidate gains, where in the community, where I would make the argument, this is where Black politics thrives, we have to, bring that into the institutional spaces. And that's where we see movements where we can actually talk about, what isn't controversial in one space, but then we can really push the paradigm and challenge it in another space. I'll stop there. I could keep going, but I think in a general sense, what is being produced in the neoliberal university in terms of type of education, and then ultimately, how do we think about our students receiving it?
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Lawrence, and for bringing in the both the larger picture as well as the sort of concrete material realities and this question of production and what we're actually producing in the university. So thanks for that. Rabab, would you like to?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. And of course, I concur with acknowledgement that the lands we teach and work on are belong to indigenous communities that are stolen, unceded, and must be returned to indigenous communities, just like the question of Palestine. I want to, when we talk about racial capitalism and when we talk about the ways in which the university has been connected with that, I think it's really important to also go back and say that we are in the United States, which is a settler colonial state from its beginning, that was built on the genocide, attempting genocide against indigenous populations, and actually disseminating a lot of indigenous communities, cultures, and relationship with their land and culture and so on. Kidnapping and imprisonment and enslavement of African people. And historically, if we talk about this is a very long history of repression that we can discuss a little bit later on. So I think it's really important for us to kind of like keep this in mind. This is what the context we're on. The university itself is not immune from that. Whether we're talking about the universities in Palestine and the ways in which multinational neoliberal organizations have been trying to impose what curriculum is being taught, how universities treat their students, how universities administrations treat their faculty and their staff, and so on. And by contrast, the unity and the solidarities that come together from the various groups that are basically repressed by that. And I would want to speak about, I mean, in the university itself, one of the main issues that we confront, and I say the university in general, is that, and as universities have been liberal, now they're moving into neoliberal and further corporatization, they are very much interested in actually pushing what they would call, quote unquote, the marketplace of ideas, which is sort of supposed to be a capitalist model, in which they push faculty to compete with each other. They push faculty to displace other faculty. The success of one faculty member is supposed to be built on the ruin of other faculty and so on. So this is one of the aspects of it. The other aspect of it, that there is no encouragement of accountability. And am I okay now, Jamila, with the audio?
Still a little scratchy.
Okay, all right. Is that better?
No, I'm afraid not. Is there, do you have your mic on?
How about this?
No, it's.
Before it was working well, but now, try this. How is this now?
Let's try that. That sounds a little bit better.
Okay, all right. So
Well,
I will just try not to shift this laptop that is being given to me by my neoliberal university. That doesn't really work very well. But in any case, and I think so, there is also the question of, yes.
It might be the headphones. Maybe if you take the headphones out, is that
How
possible?
is this?
And like unplug them. I wonder if
But
this
if I don't try that, is this better?
Try.
Okay, I was trying to do that without the headphones first. All right, so just to go back to the discussion, is that it also affects our relationship as scholars and as scholars in solidarity with the staff and in solidarity with our students. And what is it that we teach our students? In the sense that the university does not demand accountability for the scholarship, for the work that we do at the university by the communities from which we come. So there is this something that has been increasingly happening. And I would just say, for example, San Francisco State University, which is part of the California State University, the largest public system in the United States, has been increasingly becoming much more corporatized, much more accountable to private interests rather than to the public itself, the people, the taxpayers' money, and also to our own public at the university. And of course, the fact that we have the union that is very strong, that is pushing back against that. And I will leave that to my colleague and comrade James Martel to speak about that more. But I can say some of the things that have been basically affecting us at the university and affecting, whether you're talking about the Ahmed Studies and Ahmed Studies program, the Arab and Muslim ethnicity and diaspora studies, whether you're talking about the ways in which we have been targeted. And I want to speak about a couple of issues that have been driving the ways that we have been treated by the university, and where is this coming from? So, for example, the Zionist groups that you've named, Corina, in the introduction, many of them have, by the way, defined the ways in which they target us and attack us as a question of national security of the United States. And that is very much the business of the Campus Watch, Middle East Forum, and the David Horowitz, supposedly Freedom Center. That's what they're actually specializing in, attacking of the left and so on. But the university itself has been responding to the ways in which these organizations have attacked us. AMCHA project, for example, accused me of misusing university funds in 2014 because I co-organized and led a delegation of academic labor and academic delegation to Palestine, where we met with 200 people throughout Palestinian walks of life, politics, diversity, and so on. And two of the people who we've met with, they singled out was Sheikh Ra'ed Salah, who's the head of the Islamic movement inside the 1948 areas, Palestine, and Layla Khalid, who was also came up again when we, Professor Kinekawa and I, organized an open classroom in September 2020 in order for us to have, it was called Whose Narratives, Gender Justice and Resistance, the conversation with Layla Khalid that you've mentioned. And in both of these, they targeted Layla Khalid and they said, I was organizing meetings with terrorists, and this goes against the interest and the material interest of taxpayers and so on. They failed, but they continued to come into that, and that also coincided with the ways in which the university has become more and more and more privatized and has become much more accountable to private interests. So we can speak about what happened with that webinar, the ways the university president herself said that even though she claimed that she supports academic freedom, her actions were not the same because she said she understands Zoom for its private terms of service, even though the university has a contract with Zoom for the service of over 450,000 participants, faculty, students, and staff at the university. And you are supposed to be able to uphold the contract, at least in which you are supposed to be able to have control over your curriculum, academic freedom for your faculty, the ability of the students to interact with each other. However, Zoom decided to shut us down, and the university president, our university president herself, has justified that. The other aspect of it that also affect us directly, but also indirectly, for example, the university has defined the ways in which the production of knowledge at the university is tied into what they call quote-unquote student success. And the way they define student success is by graduation rates, irrespective of whether students learn or they didn't learn, whether we have been able to mentor the students and enable them to be able to withhold their very terrible conditions in terms of like our students are sometimes they're first in their families to go to college. Many of our students come from communities that do not have papers, families that do not have papers, and thus are subjected to ICE raids and imprisonment and deportation. Many of our students work 3 or 4 different jobs to be able to withhold themselves together, and many of them, is it time for me, Jamila?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I will stop at that, and I will come back to this discussion. I just want to say that we have something called the University Corporation at San Francisco State that actually funnels all private donations through to the university that we do not have access to, and we are unable to know what is going on. And now this private corporation, the University Corporation, actually also controls the Cesar Chavez Student Center that was built by student money and student fees. And one of their first actions when they took over the Cesar Chavez Student Center was actually to undermine and destroy the custodians who were working there, who were trying to organize, and majority are also immigrant and indigenous and custodians of color. So they were the first act of them, which was very interesting, like Reagan did in 1980 when he destroyed the PATCO union. This was the same thing that the university has done when they took over the Cesar Chavez Student Union by destroying the custodian. So this environment in itself, in short, it does very much affect how we are functioning and how we work and act within this context. And I will stop at that.
Thank you, Rabab, for making so many important connections. Nardine, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much to the speakers before me. It's always great listening to you, whether it's at events or meetings, and just learning from all of the trials and tribulations that you faced also specifically, Bob, and just seeing how these things play out coast to coast. And I also really appreciated Professor Lawrence's answer on the nature of the neoliberal university and how it shapes our organizing, because ultimately it is that, it is a neoliberal space that's meant to kind of churn out the next like petty bourgeois class of the ruling class essentially. But at CUNY, to me, this has always been a battleground. I've attended CUNY from 2012 to 2022, so for about 10 years. But when we talk about CUNY's history, I always have to go back and mention the 1969 Black and Puerto Rican student strike for open admissions that completely changed the character of CUNY in order for it to be a place where we can push for revolutionary change on this level. So this kind of work has been happening for so long, and we're just part of that kind of continuum in resisting the racist and sexist institutionalized racism and all of the other issues that come up at these universities. It's supposed to be one of the largest Black and brown public university working class systems. Public working class university systems in the country. But, we're constantly fighting against structural racism, against Zionism, against privatization, and so much more. But I think, why we've been able to maintain resistance at CUNY without falling into these into the confines of this system that CUNY has created is because so many organizers lead with the understanding that our university should be serving our communities ultimately. So we fight back on every level, not just on student issues like tuition hikes, but also for staff and workers and for the communities that our universities are built on, and understanding that all these things come together. It's going beyond changing the curriculum, but pushing the university in the direction of being accountable to our broader communities, like with CUNY Law, with every meeting that we had with administration and all the efforts that we had in trying to educate people about the Zionist attacks that I was facing. We brought in this support so that it was support for the Palestinian people, and every statement that came out every year, whether it was from the students, the university itself, we implored people to not just talk about defending me as their colleague or a Palestinian student who attends the university, but talking about the Palestinian struggle as a whole, whether it was rejecting the deal of the century, which was happening, I think, in my first year of being a law student, openly, to talking about the Palestinian right to resist annihilation and resist oppression, resist Zionism ultimately. So we kind of have to think beyond just the students or like the people who are part of this system that they want to turn out, this like elite understanding, but also, take it to what our people on the ground are facing and how are we complicit in that. So if anything, me being attacked at CUNY, showing the true face of Zionists who bring down anyone who talks about Palestinian freedom. This actually helped us in pushing for BDS, right, as the students and as faculty, in defeating the IRA resolution CUNY-wide, and CUNY Law being one of the main organizations, along with CUNY for Palestine, or I guess CUNY for Palestine was kind of like, re-energized around that time to fight this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So, we can start with student issues, with faculty issues, but always taking it beyond that. And we don't always have to accept the university's claims. The chancellor has claimed, and many people have claimed for years, that CUNYs cannot endorse BDS because of the executive order of the New York State governor, saying that, public institutions can't do business with those who boycott Israel. But, we can endorse BDS, and we did endorse BDS. And we don't have to operate within the confines of their institutional mechanisms, because we can push back on them and resist their policies and the stances of administrators like the CUNY chancellor. I don't accept this claim that many from CUNY have tried to make, from the Zionist administrations have tried to make, by saying that this is not something that we can even participate in. What we have to think beyond that and push beyond that, and we do, and we did. And I don't know if CUNY is preparing any sort of backlash other than constant statements by the chancellor, who makes it very obvious that he's being pushed by outside organizations to undermine his own students, and his own faculty and people who he should be protecting. In his statements beyond that, I haven't seen any institutional pushback against us as students, because this is protected free speech. And even if it wasn't, we don't have to accept these racist policies or laws or executive orders that try to back us into a corner. The only way that we can defeat them is by challenging them. And this is what, we do here. So we should use the resources that we can get from the university, whether it's the platform, the free printing, challenging these institutional claims that they make, to prove that we can push for BDS, so that we can inspire students, faculty, organizers around the country to also do the same, because we know these anti-BDS executive orders and laws are being passed everywhere. As mentioned, also the recent case that might be going to the Supreme Court to challenge the fact that they're trying to say that we can't boycott Israel. So just because these institutions try to limit the way that we work, the way that we organize, we can reject that, and we know what's right, and we can continue to build for that. So I think there's a lot more that we can talk about with specific examples that I mentioned, but I'll just end with saying, being at a neoliberal university like CUNY, like every university system in this country, did help shape my organizing, because I saw firsthand how complicit this university was, not in just my oppression, but the oppression of so many people. And as a student who paid tuition to that, not only did I feel a responsibility to my people to fight against, the Zionist stances that they take, but a responsibility to all oppressed people fighting for liberation, who come from these communities, who are my classmates, that are being subjected to the same oppression that we are by universities that we pay tuition to. So, we can always look at these places as a battleground and take it before. Sorry, I just saw the time message now.
Thanks for that, Nardine. Excellent, really great points about not only how the neoliberal institution or university shapes or constrains us in terms of organizing spaces, but also how important it is to fight back and resist and not accept these repressive mechanisms, and not allow them to set the terms in which we organize in solidarity with Palestine liberation and the liberation of other oppressed people. So thanks for that. Wonderful. James, would you like to come in now? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you so much, Karina. And thank you to all the conference organizers and my fellow panelists for this really interesting panel. I think mostly what I'll talk about today is from my capacity as a union activist and a campus president of our chapter. But for this question, I thought I would take a slightly more broad perspective to say that I learned something about neoliberalism, that I saw a lecture about it actually that really explained to me what neoliberalism is. And basically the person who was giving the lecture was saying that we tend to think that neoliberalism is about what it says it's about, which is economic efficiency, rationalization, et cetera, but it's actually only about naked power and creating precarity in everybody so that it can better control it and dominate us. once I understood that, it really helped make sense to me how my administration at SF State operates, and how pretty much the administrations at every single institution of higher education across the country and the world that I know of operates. Because they really, what I've seen, and Professor Abdulhadi will certainly testify to this as well, is that these arms of the administration that are purportedly to help faculty to rationalize things, to make things work, basically become weaponized and do the opposite. So just to give two quick examples, in my university, and it might have changed recently because they've completely revamped the whole place, but I find that the Title IX office is completely weaponized, so that they tend to attack people like Professor Abdulhadi. They tend to, it basically has a right-wing kind of aggressive focus to it. When people make accusations of racism, they're never found guilty. But on the other hand, like Black and brown faculty are often subject to these very, very humiliating and lengthy investigations of baseless things, and it has the effect of silencing and shutting them up. I think that's in general because neoliberalism is much more comfortable with right-wing than left-wing activism, because right-wing, has and racist and all of it is perfectly compatible with capitalism, which after all is what neoliberalism is about. Whereas left-wing activists, and I would very much include a lot of Palestinian causes in that, are threatening to capitalism. So I think for that reason, you get a kind of a unbalanced kind of issue where the surface facade of neutrality really becomes a way to disguise a pretty aggressive kind of form of hostility and so forth. I don't really I'm probably preaching to the converted on this. For those of you who have a lot of experience with dealing with campus administrations. And I wanted to, I will say one thing more specifically, just to give an example of what I'm talking about. There was a case a few years ago on our campus when a fair was called the Know Your Rights Fair, was to talk about kind of people that were being kind of attacked by Trump in the first year of his administration. There was a grievance filed against the organizers for failing to invite SF Hillel to the organization to be part of it. And initially, the grievance claimed anti-Semitism, but they had to take that back because there were actually several Jewish groups involved in the fair. So then they switched to this other thing called viewpoint discrimination. And I talked to the lawyers at the CFA, my union, the central union office, and they could not believe their ears. They said they'd never heard of such a thing. It wasn't a thing, blah, blah, blah. But so viewpoint discrimination means that if you're discriminating against anybody's based on their political viewpoint, that becomes something actionable. And essentially, as the lawyers were explaining to me, they seemed that they were creating a new policy out of thin air in order to address, in order to complete the desire to sort of oppress and go after the organizers of the Know Your Rights Fair. So that's an example, and unfortunately, viewpoint discrimination, I think, has become codified, at least in my university and others, as a thing, even though it wasn't a thing originally. So it's always adapting, and once again, it's the face of neutrality disguises a way in which it's anything but neutral, and it makes it very difficult as organizers to sort of keep up with this ever-shifting thing, especially because it shows this apparently benign face. I mean, it speaks all the language of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and all that stuff. But I really do believe all of that is a smokescreen to allow them to just kind of continue on their way to promote white supremacy. So that's just been my experience, and that's something that we've have to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks for that, James. Thanks for really parsing through some of the particular mechanisms that are used in the new McCarthyism, or by the new McCarthyism, not some of which are presented as there to protect workers and students, Title IX, for example, but actually, as you said, get weaponized, and then also thinking about the adaptability of these mechanisms. So, if the anti-Semitism accusation doesn't work anymore, then switch to viewpoint discrimination. So it's a really adaptive, as the original McCarthyism in all forms of power are. So excellent. Thanks for that. I'll pass now the floor back to Laith for the second round.
Thank you, Karina, and thank you all for sharing your own experiences and viewpoints on this. And I think James did a good job on bridging the connection to this next section, focusing on the new McCarthyism. And so we wanted to ask all of our panelists, what are some key successes of Palestine solidarity organizing at your university in the past few years? And how do you understand the connections between these successes and the Zionist backlash? What are the particular ways the new McCarthyism manifests itself in your university, and how has it impacted you personally and Palestine solidarity organizing? And I'm going to pass it to Rabab Abdulhadi.
Thank you. Tell me, how is my sound? Is it good?
Much better.
Okay, all right. So let me just go back to what Corina was saying at the beginning about the whole question of McCarthyism, and I really think that we started on a very good way in kind of like thinking about what is neoliberalism and what is the corporate university. What does it mean? McCarthyism. I just want to remind us that what it did. McCarthyism was to isolate, to make people radioactive, to threaten their careers, to punish them for their own viewpoints. And this is what the whole period of the Cold War during the US, and it goes back to the whole history of US as a very repressive settler colonial state that has continuously excluded, placed people in concentration camps like the Japanese people, has targeted the communists, has deported actually communists, anarchists, and socialists in the Palmer raids, and so on and so forth, continuously, and has continued to do that. And this has historically been part of this history. So, but I want to say that the new McCarthyism, it's sort of, when we're talking about it, we're specifying it is about Palestine, but it's not just exceptionalizing Palestine. So, but part of it is to use the whole question of the Zionist claims that we are practicing anti-Semitism because we are advocating for justice and for Palestine as part of the indivisibility of justice, and because we are saying that it is not okay to have a settler colonial project in Palestine that tries to displace the people, that tries to get rid of the Palestinian people, and that tries to actually use a very horrible tragedy in the history of humanity, namely the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews perished, as a way in which to say that this justifies the erasure of the Palestinian people and the displacement of their lands, and the attempt to actually completely make them disappear, which has failed. As we know, it has failed as a Zionist project. But when Israel fails in that project, its supporters in the US have resorted to what we call the new McCarthyism, in which they are using similar tools, but instead of talking about communism, although there is a very anti-left right wing, as James has said, and this is something that I've mentioned before, is manifests itself in Campus Watch and Middle East Forum, manifests itself in David Horowitz, manifests itself in Anti-Defamation League, that historically has spied on all progressive movements, manifests itself today in many Zionists who are saying that this is the left radicalism or the support for Palestine disguises itself in anti-Semitism, because we are trying to we are criticizing Israel, we criticize the settler colonial project, and including, and as James said, including many of our Jewish comrades, sisters and brothers, who actually say that Israel does not speak in their name. So anytime any of this stuff happens, we are being punished by attempting to threaten us at our jobs, like what happened to Stephen Salaita when he was basically fired from his job at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And this is where the neoliberalism connection comes in, because both the chair of the board and the provost both were benefiting from companies that actually were donating as well. So it wasn't just about, quote unquote, a political question that the Zionists tried to make it happen. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that it is in order, the way I would just say, you asked me to talk about my experience, the way it has happened is that I have been targeted also by the university. The Zionists pressured and waged the campaign. But let's just also acknowledge that the university, when you come to the university is already, there is pre-existing Islamophobia, pre-existing Orientalism, pre-existing colonial feminism, which is very much manifested in both our university president, university provost, and university dean, who's soon to become provost, and we can talk about that in details if we want later on, who actually come in already with a predetermined mindset, thinking about what Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians might already be labeled and fit the mold in which the Zionist movement has tried to put us in. And of course, they benefited a lot, both post 9/11, 2001, in the sense that they've actually said that, well, we're in solidarity with the United States. See, we're all against terrorism. And one of the university president at the time, Corrigan, actually told Palestinian students after the General Union of Palestine Students was sanctioned in 2002, and they said that this is unfair, we should be unsanctioned and we should be able to practice. He said to them, why should I do that? So you can go get, you can just bring rocks or bombs and throw them at people and so on. This is the whole continuous thinking about it. So these kind of mindsets that are already existing, the racist, white supremacist, right-wing mindsets are already existing, come together with neoliberalism, come together with the ways in which we get punished as a result of our advocacy and so on. So I would just also add a couple of other examples that have happened to me. For example, when I criticized the previous university president, President Wang, for welcoming Zionists to campus, I was attacked by the president. I was asked by the university dean in three emails and by the university president to actually remove a post I posted on my website, and members of the Ahmed community posted on the Ahmed website, that has a young student with a t-shirt that says, I support Palestinian, I support Palestine, free Palestine, I support BDS, I am anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic, free Palestine, or something of this sort. Actually, it's a beautiful t-shirt that was posted by many groups, including my own students, Jews Against Zionism, a group that was formed in order to also protest President Wang's welcoming Zionists to campus. The university provost demanded that I take down the Facebook page, or else I will be facing disciplinary mechanisms. Before her, the dean has already sent me 3 emails about that. And when I responded to them, and it was very interesting because we were in Palestine at a Teaching Palestine conference in 2018, and I responded and I said, you are violating my academic freedom. You are basically practicing neo-McCarthyism, but I didn't say neo-McCarthyism. I said, you are violating my academic freedom. And what happened is that the university president and the CSU chancellor both condemned me, and I started receiving more hateful threats, hateful emails. Some of the language I can't even repeat in our discussion and so on, because it was very foul, very racist language. One of the emails sent to me, why don't you go back to Ramallah, Mogadishu, or Tehran? And I'm actually from Nablus. I'm not even in Palestine. I'm not from Ramallah. But it doesn't really matter. And they named me all sorts of ways. And it was also around the same time that Trump was also calling our countries, the shithole countries, was telling Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib to go back. So this was very much the sort of coming together of the racism, Orientalism, Islamophobia, and colonial feminism, along together with the white supremacy, along with the new McCarthyism and the ways in which we were punished for what's going on and affecting our careers. And there have been demands for firing me, for me losing my job, and so on. And the university has also tried to do that. Unfortunately, they have failed, and we are still here, and we have achieved all these victories recently, which we can talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelhadi. And I thank you again for grounding it in what is the neoliberal university, because we hear that term often, but we don't actually usually hear kind of reflections on what that means for individuals. And that the goal is to really isolate, which means breaking solidarity by censoring not only their professional academic work, but their own activism and ability to resist attacks to their person. And so we're going to go on to Nurdine next.
Thank you. I feel like, we talked a little bit already about how, some of the key successes of Palestine solidarity organizing at CUNY, whether it's building the movement for Palestine CUNY-wide. Corinna already mentioned all of the successes with the PSC and with CUNY Law, in the past few years, whether it's the statement that CUNY Law released supporting Palestinian activism last summer, about a year ago, or the defeating the IRA resolution in the University Student Senate of CUNY, which is the student government body that makes up like every single CUNY student government body coming together on every campus. But this has been we've really taken it to new heights even more over the past 6 months. As you've heard, student and faculty organizing at the CUNY School of Law and beyond have succeeded in winning multiple victories, including the student government voting to endorse a BDS resolution in December 2021, and the CUNY Law faculty voting unanimously, by the way, which is a really important point to emphasize, that it was unanimous, to endorse the student government resolution last month. To me, even being voted by the graduating class to deliver the student commencement address, because the students knew precisely that I would talk about Palestine, and that's exactly what they did want me to talk about. So it's not just institutional wins, but building, not just getting the institution to notice us at CUNY Law and support us with these statements, but it's a testament to how much our organizing has helped so many people learn about Palestine, and want to give a platform to Palestine, because the student speaker is elected by majority. So the fact that my entire cohort, or I guess majority, at least for the most part, wanted their commencement speech for their graduation to be about Palestine by voting me, and just goes to show how how Palestine organizing has impacted them, and how important and critical they believe that this is. But in response to these victories, Zionists are currently on the defense from the campuses to the streets. Members of New York City Council's Committee on Higher Education announced that they would be holding a sort of kangaroo court hearing investigating anti-Semitism on college campuses, but that they've explicitly mentioned themselves that actually is about Palestine solidarity organizing. So the hearing was initially postponed from June 8th, and it's since been rescheduled for Thursday, June 30th. So be on the lookout. I think we'll announce this again at the end. But these council people who conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, like Eric Dinowitz and Councilwoman Ina Vernikov, the two members on the committee who are leading the charge, are explicitly seeking to silence pro-Palestine speech on CUNY campuses and other college campuses across the city, and to marginalize Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim students, faculty, workers, and all those who stand with them. So right now, the Palestinian movement in CUNY and New York City is under attack politically and ideologically by Zionist politicians, NGOs, media outlets, and the Israeli government itself, who are all directing time, resources, money, and energy towards cementing the idea that supporting Palestinian liberation amounts to anti-Semitism. And we recognize that the CUNY chancellor's constant statements undermining our work and distancing himself from me specifically as the commencement speaker. In a statement, he said that, like, he made it clear that I was voted by my class and not picked by the university, kind of showing that would never happen. This is all an effort to hinder the growing effectiveness of Palestine solidarity organizing in the US. And this has been accompanied with the rise of the McCarthyite naming and attempted blacklisting of activists through Canary Mission, which we know exists to demonize and so-called expose pro-Palestinian activists, with the explicit goal of damaging our professional and educational reputations. And I've been featured on Canary Mission for years, but more and more members of our organizations continue to be added. And many other organizations, too many that I care to name, but Corinna helpfully mentioned at the beginning, keep making videos and launching campaigns to defame and bring down Palestinian organizers. But why do they go through such lengths to suppress a supposedly marginal movement in favor of Palestinian liberation? The answer lies in the same logic which ties tuition hikes to the oppression of the Palestinian people. We live in the center of imperialism, the headquarters of worldwide oppression, the United States, because it's the same force of US world imperialism that reinforces the occupation of Palestinian land, murders Black people in cold police violence, and deports families all across the US on a daily basis. So imperialists understand, just as we do, that the only solution to these issues is a broad movement of revolutionary anti-imperialist forces from different groups seeking to challenge this. And they must suppress our movement because they know that it will grow into an upheaval that will not only end and challenge Zionism, but tear U.S. imperialist project from its roots worldwide and at home. This type of repression is particularly important in the university because this is where, as we mentioned before, the ideology of the ruling class is shaped and reinforced to create the next generation of administrators of imperialism. So we seek to liberate CUNY for the people, building a university that teaches the real history of the oppressed people of New York City and the world, in order to prepare students not to maintain the world as it is, but to challenge it. So the Zionist Organization of America, the CUNY administration, the New York City Council, and even, the Lawfare Project and so many others, and the ruling classes in general, will do anything in order to stop us and keep our university and our people oppressed. But at the end of the day, I always say, these challenges that are meant to fill us with fear, anxiety, trying to undo our work have actually just only time and time again bolstered the work that we do on campus and have earned it more support because Zionists continue to expose themselves with these cheap, I don't really have a better word for it right now, but just stupid tactics that make it very clear who is fighting on the side of justice and who is trying desperately to end that. They keep saying that Jewish students at CUNY feel unsafe. Meanwhile, the Jewish Law Students Association has repeatedly made multiple statements throughout the last 3 years that I've been a student that not only do they feel safe and support the work that we're doing, but they cherish being students together with me, with other Palestinian students, being in Students for Justice in Palestine, and pushing for this BDS resolution. So the fact that these Zionist council members and organizations continue to lie and speak on behalf of students that they claim are feeling unsafe or create this idea and conflate Zionism with Judaism is actually anti-Semitic in and of itself, because it presupposes that, Jewish people should be aligned with the settler, fascist, genocidal state that's oppressing the Palestinian people, when the majority of Jewish students at CUNY Law, at least institutionally, have made it clear time and time again that this is not their stance. So going so far as making their constitution, amending it to be explicitly, anti-Zionist. So the fact that all of the students at CUNY see this play out really expose these Zionist figures and organizations for who they are, and expose this new McCarthyism that's really just smoke and mirrors that they try to get, that they try to play mind games with us. But we continue to resist and rise above that and continue to make gains, not only in favor of the Palestinian people, but, for all oppressed people. So I see the time and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nardine. And thank you for touching on how much progress this movement has made in informing students and faculty who are on board with the movement. And although the institutions are pushing back, the support is there. And for reminding us that this is an issue that's grounded in the same ideology that's endemic to the United States, which is why folks here have experienced such aggressive backlash. And so next we will be going to James.
Thanks, Laith. Yeah, I was just gonna say a couple things. One is to kind of think about the new McCarthyism in terms of the old McCarthyism and what the differences are. And I think the main difference is that the old McCarthyism was, as horrible as it was at least fairly straightforward. It explicitly said it was out to get communists, and it went after them, et cetera, et cetera. The new McCarthyism is much more complicated because it never says that it's doing what it's doing. So you'll never get anyone who's saying, I'm against academic freedom, or I'm against this or that. They always are kind of claiming to be virtuous, and that is an ongoing problem for those of us who are resisting the kind of things that they're actually doing. Another thing to mention is that I don't think that the administration is monolithic. There's lots of different moving parts, and it's all very complicated. So I think, for example, our university is itself under a lot of pressure from the larger system. So we're part of the California State University system, of which there's 23 campuses, and the administration themselves are under extreme pressure to sort of, kind of go with the program and sort of shut down academic freedom and control it and oppress and all that kind of stuff. And furthermore, even within the administration, there's conflict because, for example, Professor Abdelhadi was constantly getting issues from her own college, the College of Ethnic Studies, which itself is a very oppressed college and treated very badly by the rest of the administration. So often they would set different people against each other. And that's sort of a tried and true tactic that kind of divide and conquer, I guess you could say. And in that way, the larger administration doesn't have to do a lot of the dirty work. They sort of force other people to do it for them. So there are all these ways in which this form of new McCarthyism has some very particular kind of aspects to it that I think any kind of organizing effort has to address and has to think about. I'll give a very quick example. I think I'll talk about it more in the final round, but of ways to that we have been able to push back. And I know that's the theme of the last question, but just to speak very quickly in terms of academic freedom itself, which is sort of one of the big most important issues. There is and I think Professor Abdelhadi already referred to this, but there was a very notorious incident where there was a Zoom seminar that Professor Abdelhadi, along with another professor, Tamami Kinakawa, were going to put on, where students were going to meet Leila Khaled, who was a Palestinian activist, and the university, essentially failed to stop Zoom from shutting it down. And one piece of that, just to sort of give a little piece of how this works, is that even though the CSU, the larger systems attorneys, actually said that Leila Khaled, because she had early been associated with this group that had been labeled a terrorist group, the idea was that to have this seminar would violate Homeland Security regulations to giving aiding and abetting a terrorist. The CSU's own lawyers said that was nonsense and there was nothing to that. But nonetheless, the provost of the university sent Professors Abdelhadi and Kinakawa an email saying, "Hey, just so you know, you might end up in jail if you do this. You're totally on your own. Find a lawyer. Blah 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 blah." It's sort of, to me, epitomized the way the new McCarthyism worked. Never said, "I am against this and I don't want you to have this meeting." It's simply sort of said, "Hey, just informing you, by the way, that you might go to jail," which is actually completely not true. They were never in danger of going to jail, as by their own attorneys. But you see, it's like a way to sort of it's very passive aggressive, I guess I would say, at the bottom line. It's very aggressive, but it does so in a way that sort of denies any kind of intent. And in fact, if anything, the intent was always, always followed by, of course, we support academic freedom to the most and the fullest and the thisest and the thatest. But when push comes to shove, it's always the opposite. So there's a way of sort of evading and avoiding that, I think, and I'm not trying to say anything good about the old McCarthyism, which is, of course, also horrible. But the new McCarthyism has this other quality to it. So.
Thank you, James, and thank you for touching on how administrators are under pressure from a larger system, and that even oppressed groups like the College of Ethnic Studies are putting pressure on their own faculty, despite the pressure on themselves, which I think shows the greater need for solidarity in order to really consolidate these gains. And then the last for this question will be Lawrence.
Yeah, so I'm thinking through a lot of what I've heard, and especially when thinking about McCarthyism, new McCarthyism, I think the essential thing is that McCarthyism was a response to a system in crisis. And as I'm, thinking about the comments from the other panelists, I'm thinking about what is the nature of the current crisis. Certainly, McCarthyism of the 1940s was responding to, crisis in capital, but also crisis in, global white supremacy. Anti-colonialism was something that threatened the very nature of imperialism, which when I think about what James said earlier, like naked power, I think naked power is imperialism. Neoliberalism is a particular method of imperialism in response to crisis itself. So when we talk about a system in crisis, we're talking about the 1940s anti-colonial movements all over the world, fascism in Europe, revolutionary workers all over the world, 1960s, 1970s, and the US especially. But then I think about, my own labor union, the PSC, which you will not mistake for the League of Revolutionary Workers. But we passed a resolution on Palestinian solidarity, and it wasn't even a close vote, right? I think when we're talking about, this notion of crisis, is like, at what point can we look at any aspect of white supremacy and, have a conversation with anybody outside of the far right, and they come to very basic conclusions if you walk them through a series of questions. My colleagues in the delegate assembly, they were not radicals. Most of my students are not radicals. Most of my colleagues are not radicals, but they can look at, what's happening in Palestine and understand that this is a case of settler colonialism. They might not use the language, but I think the question is not so much what language they use, but what is the sensibility that has to be, made actionable. And I think that's ultimately what neoliberalism responds to. Solidarity movements throughout the 60s and 70s that they wanted to stamp out in the 80s, right? That's why they attacked unions. That's why they attacked with all mechanisms of COINTELPRO, all these different things. And that's why they really want people to think of themselves as individuals first with endless resources or access to wealth and capital. And all of this is something that is losing more and more ground when you actually talk to our students in the university. My students are in the classroom oftentimes because they don't know where else to be. And the idea that they're going to become rich capitalists and stuff like that, they've dismissed it, or they're actually talked out of it once they really have to think about the premises in which the argument exists and their own lived experiences. So I think when we talk about the gains and the wins, we're not just talking about Brooklyn College being a campus in which the backlash has been great. No, that backlash has not been great. The push, the solidarity has been far greater than the backlash. What we're talking about in terms of the backlash is a vocal minority who is still trying to convince people who are afraid that they should be afraid, where I think the biggest sign of optimism is that people are coming to these common sense conclusions, and they're understanding that white supremacy, capitalism, all these things are operating in a system in which they're not winning. Now, of course, it doesn't stop the gambler from going to Vegas and trying to win anyway, but I think we're understanding something about the system and the way it responds to crisis. And I think that's the part. And I'm thinking on the fly to some degree, but I think what we're seeing is a reemergence of solidarity in so many ways. And what neoliberalism does really well is that it co-ops messages, right? I think that's what the third question gets at, is the nature of what does it mean to exist in a time where everybody's talking about anti-racism? Amazon is talking about anti-racism while unions are being formed at Amazon in a place where people thought it was impossible. And I think that's the nature of the crisis. An Amazon company talking about anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, and stuff like that. And to the extent that people can organize against that and really take back the language that confirms a certain reality, then I think we understand what the crisis is and what the struggle is, because the Zionists are speaking loudly. And I think to what Nardine said, a lot of the Jewish people we talk to in our classrooms on campus, they're not holding Zionist lines. It's the organizations that are attacking people, and it's our administration and some of our leadership who are afraid because they don't understand that the coast is clear to really act in solidarity. And I think that's at least the liberal part of it. The liberals, and I'm not even saying this to be pejorative, but the liberals historically have often moved late to the party with the people, and they've often betrayed the people. But the idea is that, you know, they could be pushed. They'll respond more favorably once the organizing and solidarity continues to go. And I think that's where I'm optimistic, because they'll respond in a way that really makes the crisis become clear. They're already doing so. So there's probably some things that, as I even say now, that I will clean up or provide some more nuance. But I think that ties into the third question, that I think the struggle is, what does it really mean that, you know, we could say settler colonialism very easily right now in some spaces, in academic spaces. Even going back to the 1960s, 1970s, Black radicals were talking about internal colonialism in the US. I think we've abandoned that to some degree, and we're now talking about settler colonialism in the US because it connects with Palestine, it connects with all these other places, Kashmir, et cetera. And I think we're seeing traction in that way, where internationalism is really becoming more of a force in our politics, which really was hard to identify in ways in the 1980s and 1990s. So I'll leave it there and leave time for some of the other responses to the third question. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawrence, and thank you for also just reminding us that you know, that the gains are there, and that there is we have the language to put a name to the gains that we've made, where we might not have had that before. And so in the interest of time, we're going to move on quickly to Karina sharing some more questions to the group, and then we're going to also answer a question from one of our viewers.
Thanks, Leigh. Yeah, so for this last round, since we are running out of time, well, I'll just state these questions, and then speakers can choose if they decide to answer one of these questions or one of the questions from the chat. So the last round of questions. With the growing popularity of terms like decolonization, and even we see some university administrations and places supporting projects to decolonize the syllabus or decolonize pedagogy, how can we protect the movement against co-optation while also potentially using this opening as an opportunity to further develop the kinds of connections that are needed for liberatory education? How do we build on past and present forms of coalition building, and many of which have been discussed already by the presenters, and also you know, within the university, outside of the university, whether it's in terms of anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, indigenous, land back, all the struggles that the speakers have all really eloquently, I think, touched on the connections between them, the organic connections between them, and all in terms of shared conditions, but also in terms of shared aims. So how can we build on those coalitions to strengthen our liberatory movements? And for this round of questions, we'll begin with Nardine.
Yeah, I think this question is actually very tied, in my mind at least, to one of the questions in the chat. And I think that question was by Joe, so I'll just like kind of speak broadly to kind of bring those things together. I think it's really important that we, and I mentioned this before, that we don't confine our movement to the limits of the institution itself. And I think this is one of our best defenses against co-optation. I think even when it comes to BDS, we passed 2 BDS resolutions at CUNY Law. And in the past, people said, oh, well, it's impossible for CUNY to pass because every single CUNY campus has to do it at one time, or all of these, essentially limits on our imagination that, aren't really based in anything accurate or realistic. I mean, what is passing a BDS resolution? It's essentially a statement. It's a political statement of not wanting to support the ongoing occupation and colonization of Palestinian people and land. And we know that many universities have passed BDS resolutions before, but in almost, if not 0 cases, and almost all, if not every case, I mean, the administration and the Board of Trustees haven't actually pulled funding from the Zionist organizations or the Israeli organizations that are being targeted by these BDS resolutions. So it's a political statement that seeks to politicize and help build the movement for Palestinian liberation on campus. And it's important for us to do that because of the ways that our campuses are explicitly working with Zionist organizations and promoting and supporting the occupation of the Palestinian people, whether through birthright trips, whether through their investments. But, the whole point of this is to build for Palestine beyond this, is to get support for political prisoners, is to understand why Palestinian people resist and why they have a right to resist, beyond just the fact that, this is an international law that occupied and oppressed people have a right to resist their occupation, and all of these different things. I think BDS is a good jumping point for people to understand why it relates to them, because they pay tuition to this university that is financially benefiting from, financially invested in the oppression of other people. So, I think like even BDS could be co-opted by universities at some point. It's kind of, and in some level, as great as it is, and because of the Zionist attacks that we face, I think I wouldn't, like, I'm not saying BDS is performative, but essentially it is making a demand or making a statement that funds and finances are pulled from funding Palestinian oppression, but in reality that's not actually done. And universities, administration, student organizations maybe get to pat ourselves on the back and say that we did this amazing thing. But in reality, we have to take it further, because that hasn't made any material changes or material gains in terms of the finances of removing them from Palestinian oppression. But we know that that's not the whole point of it. And so that's why we still fight for BDS, because by fighting for BDS on campus, at least at CUNY Law, we're able to recruit, we're able to help people understand what the Palestinian struggle is. And this way, when we have a protest, we're able to recruit 10, 20 people at every single protest at New York City right now, getting folks from CUNY Law to do legal observing, putting out that call. And, there are organizations that do that, that many CUNY Law people are invested in or work in, not invested financially, obviously, but are part of. And but the fact that they see like what their fellow counterpart students are doing on campus fighting for Palestinian liberation makes it even more clear to them why they should support Palestinian liberation and the direct ways that they can do it, whether it's doing legal observing at protests, whether it's supporting Palestinians legally as well, and all of these different things. So I think whether it's the administration itself or outside organizations saying that we have to confine ourselves to a specific framework of just BDS only, or what's very explicitly like tied to the administration itself, we can always take it beyond that, and we should always take it beyond that. Support for BDS and Palestinian liberation also, means that we should also support and demand support for Palestinian resistance, Palestinian right of return, anti-Zionism, and the full gamut of everything that we want. So hopefully that answered the question in the chat, but I'm excited to hear from the rest of the speakers.
Thank you. And I just wanted to read Joe's question that you referenced, which was how should we respond to statements that the BDS National Committee that we can support Palestinian resistance or their campaigns. And so next we will go to Lawrence.
I guess I'll respond, to Joe's question, but also to the general question, especially about how movements in the academy, like decolonizing and general use of anti-racism, might be co-opted. And I think the main way in which these ideas operate in a neoliberal university is trying to individualize what they mean. So when we talk about structures and stuff like that, that really, shows the disagreement or the different type of discourse that we might have as activists versus, administration who thinks that all claims and issues would be funded through the funneled through the diversity, equity, inclusion office, being managed by a lawyer. And I think these issues are campus-wide issues that should be taken up by the people who have a stake in the university, who comes from different communities. And I think that's the key. And in a very practical sense, as a professor, I cannot talk about, the history of slavery without talking about the history of what happened to indigenous people in North America. And I cannot talk about what happened to the history of indigenous people in North America without talking about settler colonialism or colonialism more generally. So we have to constantly operate a frame of reference and understanding that's very different from our administrative way of thinking about and talking about anti-racism. And it's really a battleground about what does anti-racism mean, who does it include, and who does it exclude, right? So I don't want to go back into history to make this point, but I think, this idea of civil rights as being the language that's now being supplanted by anti-racism to some extent, and I think is really a question of who controls the narrative. And I think the more and more we're in solidarity with each other, so when we're talking about the different movements in CUNY to, revive ethnic studies, Asian American studies, Black studies, indigenous studies, what do they all have in common? They have, colonialism, white supremacy in common. And to the extent we talk about whiteness studies, all these different things, anti-Semitism enters that conversation in very uncomfortable ways for many Zionists, but we can talk about the complicity of Israel and white supremacy in ways that we're taking on the claims and notions that somehow by talking about this and teaching this, we are in fact the Zionists, the anti-Semites. So I think solidarity is the simple answer. And I think where we have things like, BDS, which I think is a starting point for many of the conversations. I think what needs to happen, more diffuse, is that they come with programs and actions for everyone to see themselves being involved in some way, just like people might think about how do we talk about, police brutality and stuff like that, because these issues are interconnected. And ultimately, solidarity is the answer. So I'll leave it there. I know we're getting close on time. Thank you.
And so next, we're going to go along to James.
Thanks. Well, I just wanted, maybe I'll just sort of speak straight out of what Professor Johnson was just talking about, which is acts of solidarity and successes. And it was alluded to earlier, I think, Leif, by you. But we had what for us was quite a significant victory through these 3 statutory hearings that we held, 2 featuring Professor Abdulhadi and 1 featuring Professor Kinakawa. Very quickly, statutory hearings are something that was created by our union for when the contract itself hasn't been violated, but you still want to have a way to sort of air out grievances. And they basically work like a trial. We randomly select faculty to serve as a form of a jury. They're called a faculty panel, and they hear the case, and the administration makes the counter case. And 1 was basically a breach of contract case, which is where Professor Abdulhadi was hired under the promise that the ALMID program would be supported and expanded. They would hire 2 more professors. They never did that. In fact, they've just been trying to destroy ALMID for the last however many years. So it was pretty much a straight up breach of contract case. The second one was a case about the Zoom, that they failed to protect Professor Abdulhadi's academic freedom. And the third one was for Professor Kinakawa. It was essentially the same case. In each case, I was very, very proud of my faculty that each case, the panel unanimously ruled in favor of both Professor Abdulhadi and Professor Kinakawa. And that is a really big deal, because this is a institution of faculty self-governance. And faculty self-governance is something, of course, that we've been trying to promote, and which is, of course, something that neoliberalism is completely hostile to. Now, it is true that in each case, the president of the university vetoed the faculty decision. But my experience with statutory hearings, and this goes beyond in earlier cases as well, is that when the president does that, which they, by the way, have done in every single instance that I know about, they pay a price for it, and it causes a lot of pressure. And I think that explains why our president, in her letter at the end of the semester, spoke almost exclusively about these statutory hearing cases, because we had put out a lot of information about how, about what these were about, and urging her not to veto them, and so on and so forth. So she was under a lot of pressure. And so when she announced that she was going to give 1 of the 2 positions, I know that sounds like not much, but that was really an artifact. That was really a victory. A union our kind of faculty union is not in itself a revolutionary organization. It is itself kind of part of a neoliberal apparatus. And so I've learned that you have to find victories when they happen and recognize them for what they are. That this really was a huge victory. It really it gave Professor Abdulhadi for the first time really a day in the sun, where she was able to air her grievances, and to have the faculty support her unanimously really showed where the faculty were at, as opposed to the administration. I think it was a moral victory, but on the other hand, it was also a kind of an actual victory. I think we can build on that one case, on that one hire, and on the kind of pressures that we've got. So neoliberalism doesn't win every round, and I think it's really, really important, because of the nature of this thing, that we have to celebrate and push forward with the victories that we get. Thanks.
And finally, to close, I suppose we'll have Rubab Abdulhadi.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to be I want to first build on what James was saying. Yes, it was an amazing victory. And I think this was also defeating neoliberal and neo-McCarthyism at the university, in that our colleagues actually refused to abide by neo-McCarthyism and basically isolate me. And they pointed specifically how the university has created a hostile work environment in which they intellectually tried to isolate me, because I was pushing for the honor studies program and for what we wanted to do. And this is really based on the faculty hearing panel. I definitely 100% agree with James. And I agree with the resilience and resistance of our colleagues, our union, the broad-based coalition that came together from all over the world, from all walks of life, that came together and actually said that this program has to happen, and that you cannot really violate our academic freedom, and you can't actually have a private tech company like Zoom exercise a veto over the content of our curriculum. If that happens, what happens to our project of actually decolonizing the curriculum? And in this sense, I want to go to and connect with what Jahi has been speaking about, Professor Lawrence, in the sense that the whole question of what happened with the 60s. And we take our inspiration from what we call the spirit of 68, in which time the students led by the Black Student Union and the Third World Liberation Front waged the longest student strike in the history of the United States in 1968 and demanded the College of Third World Studies. And as a result, the College of Ethnic Studies was offered to them by the university as hoping that it would be a compromise that would shut down the activism that's going on. However, the activists who were at that time also part of the Black Panther Party, the American Indian movement, the Chicana movement, the Asian American and Asian organizing, and so on, the indigenous groups, they were all coming together, and along with the allies, along with the union, along with the Students for Democratic Society, with the members of the teachers union, and so on, they came together and they built it. And we are actually acting in the spirit of 68, decolonizing the curriculum. And this is part of the reason why the university, neoliberal universities, corporate university, President Mahoney and her ilk, and the fact that they announced the agreement, official agreement, along with the Academic Engagement Network and Hillel, which is both big-time Zionist organizations, announced by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as the advancement of fundraising. They announced that with the blessing of President Mahoney, who actually also refused to abide by the decision of the Associated Students who voted for BDS in 2020 that you mentioned right at the beginning. And she also has vetoed the decisions of our faculty hearing panel, which is the anti-democratic, authoritarian, and shows that she has no regard whatsoever for shared governance and the ways in which faculty is acting, and that is going to backfire on her. We are saying that it is not enough to have one faculty line. It is not enough to have that. You already have, the university has already came up with a contract when they recruited me and lured me away from my job at the University of Michigan here on as the director of the Center for Arab American Studies. You owe us. This is a project that needs to happen, and this is exactly why Ahmed is being targeted, and I was being targeted again and again and again. And the open classroom that Professor Kinakawa and I organized has been targeted. It is really to shut down any possibilities for us to consider Palestine as a legitimate part of the curriculum. I mean, they are, even the Lawfare executive director said at one point, after they succeeded in convincing Zoom and the university to shut us down, she said, well, they can say whatever they want outside, but they cannot speak at the university. It cannot be part of the curriculum, and so on. Well, it is part of the curriculum. The faculty hearing panel have ruled about that. The faculty hearing panel has ruled that Ahmed has to be built, and so on. And this brings up all these issues together. The last point that I want to say that this also speaks to the point that both Nardine and Jahi have spoken about, the whole question of solidarities and coming together. One is about the whole question of BDS. I should really point out that the Boycott National Committee is actually a coalition, very broad coalition, built of all the Palestinian political parties, of the various trade unions, of the various women's organizations, of various organizations that come together. And what happens in Palestine is not necessarily how people in the United States interpret it. In Palestine, there is a consensus among Palestinian groups that there is resistance in all its forms. There is popular committees, there is people who are refusing to move from their land, there are people who refuse to serve inside the 48, to serve in the Israeli military, There are all sorts of resistance that Palestinians are engaging in, resisting the blockade of Gaza, which is 15 years this year, and demanding all sorts of injustices and so on. The problem is that when it comes to the movements outside of Palestine and so on, people misinterpret what's going on, and they say, this is what it is. We're going to choose to support Palestinians in this way and not choose to support them in that way. I just want to have, Jamila, one point I want to say, because I also started a little bit late in my talk, is that I am going back to the Queer Liberation March that's happening on Sunday. I want to say that Palestinian queers have clearly said to people on the outside, you cannot just support Palestinian queers and not support the whole Palestinian society and all Palestinian people struggle for independence, for self-determination, for justice, for freedom, for our rights to be restored for all. And this is the message for everybody, that justice in for Palestine is part of the indivisibility of justice. And justice in for Palestine is indivisible and will continue to be so. And when we abide by these principles, we come together and we fight together, and we will win, and we will achieve our goals, and we will have another world. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to extend thanks to all of our panelists. I'm going to put everyone on the screen now, actually, just so that we can see everyone who worked on this. Professor Lawrence had to leave a little bit early, but keep him in your mind as well.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. So really inspiring panel, and I learned so much, and I think really given us a roadmap for how to move forward, not just in terms of resisting this new McCarthyism and consolidating our gains and our victories around Palestine liberation organizing, but liberation in general. And I just found that truly inspiring. So I just want to thank you all.